You know, there's a particular kind of tragedy that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't build slowly. It doesn't give you time to brace for it. It arrives in the dark, on a quiet stretch of road, after a long night, when everybody in the truck is just trying to get home. And that's exactly what happened just after 6 o'clock in the morning on April 28, 2018, on a stretch of Interstate 85 in rural Georgia, when a father and his son, riding together in the same truck, driving home from the same racetrack, died within moments of each other. The father had spent parts of 6 decades in NASCAR. He was 83 years old, and he was still doing it, still hauling a race car across state lines the same way he had since before most of today's fans were born. His son wasn't even supposed to be a racer. He used to be a school teacher. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the people NASCAR history tends to forget. If you're someone who loves the deeper, stranger, more human stories that the highlight reels never quite capture, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. This is the story of James Hilton and his son James Hilton Jr., and of one very simple, very cruel fact. The same drive that had defined James Hilton's entire life was also the thing that finally ended it. And it took his son with him. To understand why that's such a strange and heavy way for the story to end, you have to understand who James Hilton actually was. Because this was not some rookie who got in over his head. This was not a man chasing something that was never really his. This was a man who had already lived an entire lifetime inside NASCAR before most of his contemporaries had even finished their careers, and who by the time he was 83 years old had every reasonable excuse in the world to have hung it up decades earlier. He just hadn't. Hilton was born in 1934 in Virginia, and he came up through the sport the hard way, starting out as a mechanic rather than a driver. In 1960, he was part of the crew that helped build Rex White's NASCAR Grand National Championship. A few years after that, he became crew chief for Ned Jarrett and car owner Bondi Long. And in 1965, that partnership won the championship too. Here's what most people don't realize about that part of the story. By the time James Hilton ever climbed behind the wheel himself, he had already been a hands-on part of building 2 separate NASCAR champions from underneath somebody else's hood. Turning wrenches, calling strategy, watching other men's names get put on the trophies he helped earn. When he did become a driver, he didn't ease into it either. His 1966 rookie season remains one of the strangest and most impressive rookie years the sport has ever produced. He finished second in the entire championship point standings with 0 wins to his name. Still the highest points finish by a rookie in NASCAR history. And he backed it up by finishing runner-up in points again in 1967, and again in 1971. 3 separate seasons where James Hilton finished second in the entire NASCAR championship, running his own equipment against factory teams with real corporate money behind them. By 1968, he was running his own equipment as a full-owner driver. And in March of 1970, he picked up his first Cup win at the Richmond 500 in his number 48. And then there's Talladega, the track that this entire story is going to keep circling back to. On August 6, 1972, Hilton took that same number 48 car, a 1971 Mercury Cyclone, to Talladega Superspeedway and delivered the biggest win of his entire career. This wasn't some fluke. This wasn't one of those days where the leaders all fell out ahead of him and he just happened to be there at the end. He led 106 of the race's 188 laps, more than half the entire distance, running out front against factory-backed competition in a car his own small operation had built and maintained. At the finish, he held off veteran racer Ramo Scott by about a car length to take the checkered flag. The margin so thin, it came down to the length of one car after nearly 200 laps of racing. $24,865 to the winner. Look, that number matters because it tells you everything about what independent racing actually looked like in 1972. Not millions, not endorsement deals, not a fleet of transporters waiting in the infield. Just a check and a trophy and a long drive home. The Talladega win became the signature moment of James Hilton's entire driving career. The one NASCAR itself would point back to decades later whenever his name came up. The one race out of 602 career Cup starts that the sport chose to remember him by. Across the whole of his career, Hilton put together those 602 Cup starts, 2 wins, roughly 301 top 10 finishes, and 4 poles. Numbers that put him squarely among the most durable independent racers the sport has ever seen. And unlike almost every one of his contemporaries, he never actually stopped. When his Cup driving days wound down, he moved over into the ARCA ranks, first as a driver and eventually as a car owner. Still showing up at racetracks decades after most men his age had long since traded the garage for a rocking chair. There was no dramatic retirement announcement in this man's story. There was no farewell tour, no teary last lap, no press conference with a prepared statement about what the sport had meant to him. There was just a guy who kept showing up, year after year, decade after decade, because that's what he had always done. And he genuinely didn't seem to know how to do anything else. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds like dedication, but wasn't there a point where somebody should have said something? Where somebody close to him maybe suggested it was time to step back? And here's the thing. That question gets more complicated when you understand the other man at the center of this story. His son James Hilton Jr., known to the people who loved him as Tweety. Tweety was 61 years old in 2018, and by his mother Evelyn Hilton's own account, he wasn't supposed to end up in racing at all. He'd been a school teacher. According to Evelyn, it was James himself who talked him into quitting that job and coming out to go racing with him instead. Think about what that actually meant. A stable job, a classroom, a paycheck that didn't depend on finishing up front on a Saturday afternoon. Traded in because his father asked him to come be part of the family business instead. That's not a small decision. That's not something you do because it sounds like fun. That's the kind of choice you make when the pull of your father, and whatever it was he loved so much about that life, is stronger than the pull of the life you already have. And by every account that exists of the man, Tweety was about as far from the stereotype of a hard-living racetrack lifer as you could get. Evelyn described her son plainly. He was very pure, she said. He didn't smoke or drink or anything else. He was a very good person. Everybody loved him. That's the kind of thing a mother says about a son she's just lost. And there's no reason to doubt a word of it. Beyond that, the public record on Tweety Hilton is thin. There's no widely documented account of exactly what his day-to-day role with his father's team looked like. No detailed biography beyond what Evelyn shared in the days after the crash. What we're left with is a picture sketched in just a few honest sentences from the person who knew him best. A former school teacher, clean living, well-liked, and close enough to his father that he gave up an entire other life just to be near him. So here's where this story actually sits as it heads into its final chapter. An 83-year-old man who had spent virtually his entire adult life in NASCAR, still out there running cars decades after he had any real reason left to prove himself. And his 61-year-old son, a former school teacher, who had given up a stable life to go be with his father at the racetrack instead. Neither one of them, by any measure, needed to be doing what they were doing that particular weekend in April of 2018. Most guys who had accomplished what James Hilton had accomplished by their 80s would have been perfectly content watching the races from a couch somewhere, telling stories about Talladega 1972 to whoever would sit still long enough to listen. That's not who James Hilton was. Racing wasn't something he had done for a while and then moved on from. It was the entire shape of his life. And by 2018, that shape hadn't changed in any meaningful way since he was a young man turning wrenches on Rex White's Chevrolet in 1960. And so they went. On Friday, April 27, 2018, The Hilton operation was at Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama for the ARCA General Tire 200. James Hilton was the car owner of the number 48 that weekend, and the driver behind the wheel was Brad Smith, a longtime ARCA independent racer in his own right. The kind of underfunded, weekly grinder that Hilton himself had once been decades earlier. It's a small detail, but it tells you something important. Even at 83, even with a career full of championships and wins and decades of credibility behind him, James Hilton was still out there fielding a car for somebody else's shot at it. The exact same role reversal that had defined the very start of his career, except now he was the one signing the entry form instead of turning the wrenches underneath somebody else's hood. ARCA racing in 2018 looked a whole lot like NASCAR racing had looked back when Hilton himself was coming up. Small teams, thin budget, guys hauling their own equipment from track to track without a fleet of transport trucks or a corporate jet waiting to fly the crew home. Hilton hadn't just stayed in the sport. He had stayed in exactly the corner of the sport where he had started. The independent corner. The one where everything still depended on whether the truck made it home in one piece. And that particular Friday carried a piece of history that nobody in the garage could have known the full weight of yet. That same morning, at that same racetrack, NASCAR announced it had acquired ARCA outright, folding the independent sanctioning body that had run its own separate races since the 1950s into the NASCAR family for good. More than 60 years of ARCA standing on its own, ending right there at Talladega. On the very day James Hilton, one of the last men still racing who remembered what a fully independent version of this sport actually looked like, brought his own independent team to that same track one more time. This is where it gets really interesting, and not in a good way. The day the sport officially absorbed the last truly independent racing series into its corporate structure happened to be the same day one of the sport's last truly independent lifers was loading his race car back onto his trailer after the event didn't even go the way they'd hoped. Oil pressure problems kept Brad Smith from even taking the green flag. He was scored 31st, dead last in the field, in the final rundown. So the trip home wasn't even a trip home from a good day at the racetrack. It was a long overnight haul after a disappointing one. Hauling a car that never got to show what it could do, on the same day the sport those two men had spent their whole lives inside of took one more step away from the independent world James Hilton had never left. According to Evelyn Hilton, she spoke to her son by phone around midnight that night. Tweety told her they were finally hitting the road heading home after grabbing something to eat at a restaurant in Alabama. It was going to be a long overnight drive back, hauling a fully loaded race car on a trailer behind a GMC truck. The exact kind of drive that independent teams like Hilton's had been making for decades, long after the fans had gone home and long after the bigger, better-funded teams had already flown out. There were 3 men in that truck. James Hilton was riding in the passenger seat. His son Tweety was there with him. And behind the wheel was the team's crew chief, a man named Terry Strange, driving through the night to get the whole operation home. A GMC truck towing a trailer loaded down with a full race car, thousands of pounds of steel and rubber and fuel, rolling down the interstate in the dark with 3 men inside who had every reason in the world to just want to get home and get some sleep. Here's the thing. This is exactly the kind of overnight haul that independent race teams have been making for as long as the sport has existed. The part of racing nobody ever puts on television. 3 guys in a truck and a trailer driving through the night, because that's simply what it costs to be a small operation without the money for a room and a fresh start in the morning. James Hilton had almost certainly made a version of this exact drive hundreds of times over the decade. There was nothing unusual about it. And it genuinely wasn't even the first time this had gone wrong for them specifically. Less than a year earlier, in July of 2017, James and Tweety Hilton had already been through a version of this exact nightmare and walked away from it. Their truck and racing hauler crashed after a race at Iowa Speedway, and both father and son came out of it uninjured. That's the part that makes what happened in April of 2018 so much harder to sit with. This wasn't some freak first-time event. This was the same father and son doing the same overnight hauls they had always done, who had already had one close call together and gotten back in the truck anyway. Because that's simply what you did if you were going to keep racing. You didn't stop because it got close once. You drove home. You fixed the car. You showed up at the next race. That's the logic that had carried James Hilton through 6 decades of this sport. And it's exactly the same logic that put him in that truck one more time. Just after 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, April 28, 2018, that truck left the road on Interstate 85 near Carnesville in Franklin County, Georgia. It's rural country up there. The kind of stretch of interstate that runs quiet and mostly empty in the very early hours of a Saturday morning. Exactly the kind of road an independent racing team would be counting on to make good time on the long haul back from Alabama. The truck crossed the median and struck a creek bank. James Hilton, 83 years old, and his son James Hilton Jr., 61 years old, were both pronounced dead at the scene. Franklin County Deputy Coroner Clayton Bryant confirmed both deaths. Terry Strange, the crew chief who had been driving, survived. He was taken to a hospital in Greenville, South Carolina with broken bones. That's the defining moment of this whole story. And it's worth sitting with exactly how plain and how sudden it actually was. No warning. No drawn-out crisis. Nothing you could see building for miles down the road. A truck towing a heavy trailer in the dark, in the very early hours of the morning, simply left the road. And 2 members of the same family who had spent that entire truck ride together did not survive it. Now, you might be thinking, what actually caused the crash? And this is where the story gets a little complicated, because there are 2 different versions of what happened, and they don't agree with each other, and being honest about that matters more than picking the cleaner narrative. In the immediate aftermath, there was one account of what may have caused it that came from inside the family. Evelyn Hilton said afterward that an officer had told her Terry Strange believed James was having a heart attack right before the crash. That Terry looked over at him, lost control of the truck, went across the median, and then across the other lane of traffic and hit the embankment. That's worth being honest about exactly as what it was. A second-hand account relayed by a grieving family member, describing what a police officer told her that Terry Strange had told them in the very first hours after the worst day of her life. The actual investigation told a different story. According to the Georgia State Patrol's report, Terry Strange said he had moved from the right lane into the left lane to pass a slower vehicle when an unknown vehicle attempted to change lanes and nearly struck the truck. Strange steered onto the shoulder to avoid a collision and lost control from there. Investigators also listed a previously damaged guardrail along that stretch of road as a contributing factor. Strange was never charged. So the official version, the one that came out of an actual investigation rather than something passed hand to hand in the hours right after a tragedy, isn't about a medical emergency at all. It's about a near miss with another car in the dark, on a road with a guardrail that wasn't in the shape it should have been, and a truck pulling thousands of pounds of steel that simply didn't have anywhere left to go once it left the pavement. Both versions came from the same family's grief and the same investigation's paperwork, and they don't agree with each other. Which is exactly why it matters to say so plainly instead of picking whichever one makes for a cleaner story. The truth is that the investigation reached one conclusion: the family heard something different in the immediate aftermath. And in cases like these, both things can exist at the same time without either one being dishonest. People in the hours after a crash piece together what they've been told under the worst possible conditions. That's not a contradiction. That's just how grief and memory and second-hand information work in real time. So what happened after? NASCAR, which had just completed its acquisition of ARCA on the very day the Hiltons made their final run at Talladega, put out a statement in the days that followed. And it's worth hearing in full because of what it chose to highlight. Racing competitively in parts of 6 decades, The statement read, "James Hilton's dedication, passion, and longevity in motorsports is virtually unmatched." Hilton won the Rookie of the Year at NASCAR's highest level, the 1972 race at Talladega Superspeedway, and regularly contended for championships during the early years of his career. His racing influence continued into the ARCA series, where he competed as a driver and most recently a car owner. We have lost a truly special member of the racing family and a beloved figure among generations of competitors and race fans alike. We extend our deepest condolences to the Hilton family on the tragic loss of James Hilton and his son James Jr. Notice what NASCAR itself chose to put front and center in that statement. Not his 3 runner-up championship finishes. Not his 602 Cup starts. Not the 6 decades of longevity, although that got a mention too. The 1972 race at Talladega Superspeedway. Out of an entire career's worth of accomplishments, the sport's own official tribute reached specifically for the win that happened at the very track his final drive had just started from. Whether anyone in the communications department was aware of that particular symmetry when they wrote it, we can't know. But it's there. And it's impossible to miss once you see it. Tributes came in from drivers who had crossed paths with him too. Dale Earnhardt Jr. wrote that James was a legend, that he enjoyed his time in stock car racing, and saw the sport evolve and grow over the many decades he was involved. That's not a small thing coming from a driver whose own family name is stitched into the sport's biggest tragedies. A guy who understands better than almost anyone what it costs a racing family to lose somebody to this sport. Jimmy Johnson said he was thinking of the friends and family of James Hilton, that James was a true racer who loved the sport so much, and that it was an honor to have met him. He will be missed. And Darrell Waltrip, another guy who had raced against Hilton for years, put it in personal terms. "My heart hurts this afternoon," Waltrip wrote. "James Harvey Hilton, one of my early heroes, and his son were killed today in a car crash. James was number 48. That was my number in the late Model Sportsman series. Tried to get him to change his number. He wouldn't. We became great friends after that." Here's what most people don't realize about those tribute. Every single one of those drivers took specific time to call out how long James Hilton had actually been around. Which tells you that his longevity wasn't just a stat line in a record book somewhere. It was the thing everybody in the garage actually knew him by. Not the wins. Not the championships he helped build for other men. The fact that he simply never left. Terry Strange, the man who had been driving that truck and who survived the crash that killed both James and Tweety Hilton, gave his account to investigators. The near miss with another vehicle, the swerve onto the shoulder, the loss of control. That account is what's in the official record. What he hasn't done, at least not in anything that's been made public, is sit down and talk about it outside of a police report. About what it's like to be the one who walked away from a truck that killed 2 members of a family you'd spent years working alongside. We can only imagine what that weighs like. And it wouldn't be right to guess at it beyond that. The man survived something that killed the people riding with him. That's a weight that doesn't have a clean description. We can acknowledge it exists without pretending we understand the shape of it from the outside. As for a funeral or a memorial service, there's no clear public record of the specific details. No confirmed date or location solid enough to state as fact. What is out there is the ongoing quieter kind of memorial that tends to follow guys like James Hilton. The ones who spent their whole lives as independents rather than superstars. The ones who never had a corporate marketing department keeping their name in front of people after they were gone. Fans have kept marking his birthday every August since. Small posts. Small tributes. The kind of remembrance that doesn't make headlines but doesn't stop either. Retrospectives of that 1972 Talladega win have circulated under a hashtag that ties his name and his son's together in the same breath. Remember Harvey and Tweety, using the nicknames the people who actually knew them used. It's a small, informal thing. A fan community keeping 2 names alive on their own terms. But it says something that years after the crash, people were still pairing father and son together in the same thought. The same way they died. And that brings us back to the one detail that sits underneath this entire story. The one that nobody seems to have written down explicitly in the days right after it happened, but that's worth sitting with anyway. James Hilton and his son died driving home from Talladega Superspeedway. 46 years earlier, almost to the exact spot on the calendar, Talladega Superspeedway is where James Hilton won the single biggest race of his entire career. The win NASCAR itself reached for first when it wrote his official statement of condolence. The race he led for more than half the distance in a car his small independent team had built by hand. The win that Darrell Waltrip called him an early hero for. The moment the sport chose to define him by out of 6 full decades of showing up. Nobody planned that connection. Nobody wrote it into any tribute at the time, at least not in anything that's been publicly preserved from the days and weeks after the crash. It's simply true, sitting there in the two dates side by side. The track that gave James Hilton the defining moment of his racing life is the same track his life ended on the road home from. That's not a poetic choice. It's not a story someone shaped to make it land better. It's just a fact. And once you know it, it's genuinely hard to unknow it. Here's the thing about 6 decades in any profession. Most people, even people who love what they do, run out of road eventually. The knees go. The eyes go. The reflexes slow down enough that the decision gets made for you one way or another. James Hilton was 83 years old when he died. He had started turning wrenches on NASCAR championship cars before most of the drivers who sent him tribute messages were even born. He had watched the sport transform around him so many times that by the end, there was almost nothing left of the version of NASCAR he had come up through. The factories that had funded his competition were gone. The tracks that had once defined the schedule had been added and dropped and added again. The cars were barely recognizable. The money involved had grown into something that would have been unimaginable to the independent racer who had bought his own equipment and hauled his own trailer and finished second in the championship 3 separate times without any of it. And through every single version of the sport, through every transformation and every era, James Hilton had simply remained. Not as a symbol, not as a living museum piece brought out for an anniversary event. As an actual, working, practicing part of the sport, filing entries, fielding cars, making the long drives home. And his son, the former school teacher who gave up a classroom for a racetrack because his father asked him to come along, had been right there beside him. Every single stretch of it that Tweety was part of, he chose. He could have stayed in the classroom. He could have been the guy who visited the racetrack on weekends as a fan and went home Sunday night to grade papers. Instead, he became the guy in the truck, on the overnight haul, at 61 years old, still traveling with his father because somewhere along the way the life his father had always lived had become his life too. And I think that's the part of this story that's the easiest to skip past and the hardest to actually sit with. The tragedy here isn't just that they died. It's the specific shape of how it happened. Not in a race. Not because someone made a reckless call on a superspeedway. Not because the car failed or the setup was wrong or the driver pushed too hard on the last lap. They died on the road home. In a truck. After a day that hadn't even gone the way they wanted. After a race their car never started. After a long night that had started with dinner at a restaurant somewhere in Alabama and was supposed to end in Virginia, the same state James Hilton had been born in 83 years before. That's where the weight of this story actually lives. Not in the crash itself, because crashes happen and they happen fast and there isn't usually meaning inside them, just physics and bad luck and roads that aren't in the shape they should be. The weight lives in everything that was already in that truck before it ever left the Talladega parking lot. 6 decades of showing up. A championship car they'd built and loaded and hauled all the way from Virginia. A son who had traded one life for this one. A crew chief making the long drive through the night. And somewhere underneath all of it, The quiet fact that James Hilton would have done the exact same drive 1,000 more times if he had been given the chance. Because for him, the drive home was just part of racing. It always had been. It was just the part that didn't have a trophy at the end of it. James Hilton raced for parts of 6 decades, not as a hobby, not as a nostalgia lap trotted out for old times' sake, but as an actual working competitor, mechanic, crew chief, driver, and finally car owner. 602 Cup starts, 2 wins, 4 poles, dozens of top tens in seasons where he was running against teams that had exponentially more money and manpower. A 1972 Talladega win that the sport chose to remember him by above everything else. And a son who gave up a classroom to stand in a garage beside him and who ended up sharing not just the racetracks and the long overnight drives, but the very last one of them too. That's the story of James Hilton and James Hilton Jr., a father who never really stopped racing, and a son who left one life behind to go be part of that one instead, and who ended up on the same road, in the same truck, going the same direction at the very end of it all. If that story hit you the way it hit me when I first went down this rabbit hole, then you already know why this channel exists. There are thousands of names in NASCAR history that the big broadcasts and the mainstream coverage never quite get around to. Names that shaped the sport before the sponsorship money arrived, before the corporate machines took over, before racing became the polished product it is today. James Hilton is one of them. And now you know his story. Drop a comment below with the names of drivers or racing figures you think deserve their own video, because I promise you there are more stories like this one out there waiting. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss them when they drop. And I'll see you in the next one.